All right. Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's panel discussion with Dr. Kate Manne, who is, let me find my details here, Associate Professor of the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University, where she focuses on moral philosophy, feminist philosophy, and social philosophy. She is the author of several books, including Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, and Unshrinking, How to Face Fat Phobia, as well as many opinion pieces, essays, and reviews. Dr. Manne is going to fearlessly take questions from our panel. Many, if not all of our panelists were part of a reading group that has been reading Down Girl since January, and it should be a very interesting and enlightening discussion. I also realized that I failed to introduce myself. I am Janet Crum. I am Dean of Library Services here at Fresno State, and I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and take it from here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Manne and our panelists to the program today.
My name is Terry Wynant. I'm in the philosophy department here. I'm going to moderate this panel. Let's just have just names.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Rubacaba.
My name is Evan Rivas, and I'll be sitting in for Landon Dubois.
Hi, I'm Sophia Boutillier from the Sociology Department.
Hi, I'm Sierra Soren, also from Sociology.
I'm Carolyn Cusick from Philosophy.
And I'm Kate. Hi.
It's great that you're all here. I'm going to say just a word about format, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to ask a question. So as you're aware, we have been reading Kate Manne's book, Down Girl, as a group all semester. This has been a great experience. For some of us, it was a book we had already read. For some, it was new. We were students and faculty in a bunch of different disciplines. And if nothing else, we had the great experience of not being lonely intellectually as we studied, something that doesn't happen enough. So this has been great, and we hope to share a little bit of that vibe with you this afternoon, what it's like to think together about something that we're going pretty deep into. Okay, so we have two Sophias. You might have heard that. I'm first going to introduce Sophia Rubicalba, whom I'm going to call Sophia Philosophy, because the other Sophia is a sociologist. So Sophia's going to ask the first question.
So yeah, like Dr. Wynant said, we have been reading this book throughout the semester, and part of it was also kind of dissecting each chapter. And so one of the chapters I did alongside Dr. Boutillier actually was chapter 4. And one big thing that stood out to me was Dr. Kate's idea of hers to give and his to take. And ever since reading that, I've been seeing that everywhere, in all the shows I watch, or in just little things that I see. Another part of that was shame was a big part of that chapter. And so I guess one of my questions was how does the role of shame also mix in with the hers to give and his to take, and kind of keeping that social norm going of what she gives and what he takes?
Well, first of all, thank you so much all for having me out. I especially want to thank Dean Crum for the amazing hospitality and the whole panel, as well as Dr. Raja for originally mooting this idea. And yeah, it's just lovely to be here in this beautiful room and to get to have this meaningful discussion. So thank you. And Sophia, you ask a really great question. And I'm going to start by talking about the difference between what I think of as the feminine coded goods that women are obligated to give to usually designated privileged men under patriarchy. So the idea is a lot of patriarchy today, even in supposedly egalitarian contexts like the US and Australia, where I'm from, really consist in norms that say women should give care, deference, reproductive labor, so children, domestic labor, emotional labor, and many forms of material labor to characteristically people like their husbands. So people who they are meant to be in relationships with, where there is a kind of heterocentrism and cissexism operative too in the background, and I think we'll get into that more as we continue. But there is this presumptively heterosexual nuclear family where she is meant to give those goods to designated, typically more privileged men who then are the beneficiaries of these kinds of goods and services. So in a slogan, one way to put it is, every woman alive is in the service industry. Sort of a joke, but it's sort of not. And the nature of the service is service with a smile. So giving these goods to, again, designated privileged men is meant to be done with a sense of love, joy, seamlessness, and happiness about that kind of labor, which can sometimes, I think, be quite genuine, but still something that we should interrogate because it also serves a particular function. Now, all of these goods, almost without exception, are genuinely good things to give. However, what worries me is a kind of lack of reciprocity in characteristically patriarchal social relations, where in, again, the most kind of extreme examples, he will be designated as entitled to these goods and the kind of designated taker of things like his children, as in he will be deemed entitled to have a wife give him children, which is an interestingly problematic sentiment, and also to take things like emotional labor, domestic labor, and reproductive labor again. So the his to take and the hers to give points to this deep asymmetry in patriarchal social relations where she is deemed obligated to give and he is deemed entitled to take. Now, of course, many heterosexual couples don't necessarily abide by these norms. There are lots of us who are resisting. And there are lots of us, of course, who are not in heterosexual relationships or who are not in relationships of a characteristically intimate romantic partner kind whatsoever. So it's not to say that everyone is conforming to these norms, it's to say that there is a degree of controlling, punishment, and social enforcement of the norms, so that those of us who are resisting and deviating often have a price to pay for so doing. Now, I think that's one of the places shame comes in, but another of the places is actually what women are obligated under patriarchy to give to these designated privileged men, which is a kind of shame-free existence. So one of the examples that I give that Sophia is pointing to so nicely in her question is that when men feel shamed by women or just shamed in the eyes of the world, that is very tellingly often a very dangerous time for a woman within patriarchal marriages. So, for example, if a woman intends to leave a relationship and that intention is clear, if she actually leaves the relationship and he feels ashamed or betrayed by that perceived breach of loyalty, that's the most dangerous time for a woman by far in terms of domestic violence homicide, which I think is a really telling statistic. It's like several orders of magnitude more risky when you're thinking of leaving or planning to leave or actually have left than when you're in the relationship. And that, I think, again, has something to do with what he's deemed entitled to, including not feeling shamed by her when she says this relationship is not working, I deserve better or otherwise, and he feels like a lack of the kind of admiration that men are also deemed entitled to. Another scenario that I look at is so-called family annihilators. So who saw The White Lotus? Okay. Not as many as I had hoped. Okay. No spoilers then. But just to say there's a plot line there that picks up on this actually very common phenomenon where it's a horrifying one, but once a week on average in the US, a man, when he feels the prospect of shame, so characteristically things like he's losing his job, he's losing his livelihood, he's about to go bankrupt, things like that, are the scenarios where he will sometimes murder his children and wife before generally committing suicide. And those scenarios are theorized to be largely a flight from shame. He doesn't want to have to look his wife in the eye. He shrinks from this shaming gaze of the world and his family because his sense is that better that people be annihilated than that they look at me and don't look up to me, but rather look down on me as a man. So these norms of masculinity have enormously pernicious consequences and result in heinous crimes and wrongdoing towards women and children. And yeah, I think that has a lot to do with this sense that shame is something to flee from, especially as a man, and that you're entitled to destroy others to avoid that shaming gaze. I feel like this mic is... Can I just talk? Can people hear me in the... Okay, all right, I'm going to put it here and hope. Give me indicators if at the back it's not picking up, but I feel like it's too close. Is that... Yeah, okay. Sorry, I just don't want to...
It's like a little whistle.
Yeah, it's a little whistle. So just last thought on shame. So shame is a moral emotion that's complex, but one thing we can think about is the kind of characteristic posture of shame. So eyes lowered, head bowed, wanting to disappear. That is what I call ordinary shame, and I distinguish it from entitled shame, which I think conforms more with Erik Erikson's famous quote about shame. He said, shame wants to destroy the eyes of the other. And to me, that's like very extreme. I feel ashamed all the time. I'm a very shame-prone person, and I don't generally want to destroy anyone. I want to disappear. And sometimes it does come with a kind of desire to just evaporate. So the idea is entitled shame, which is something that is characteristic of certain hyper-privileged, entitled men, does lash out and think, yes, I'm entitled to destroy people who might make me feel ashamed, even if I love them. I don't want to feel ashamed vis-a-vis my wife and children if I'm losing my livelihood, rather than seeking to flee or disappear in the way I think most people characteristically experience shame, which is we hunch, we shrink, we don't lash out and try to destroy others' gaze. So Sophia, does that help with the relationship between what he feels entitled to, what's his to take, includes a shame-free existence?
Oh, no, yeah, 100%. Thank you.
Thanks. And Evan Rivas, who is, you'll explain.
Hello, my name is Evan Rivas. I'm a fourth-year philosophy student, and I will be sitting in for Landon, who couldn't be here today, and I will be reading one of his questions. The first one, Dr. Manne, would be, Dr. Manne, I'm so sorry. In this work, you heavily rely on extreme examples of fiction and actors. One specific example that stumped us in our reading group was Gone Girl. Why use these extreme examples to depict misogyny when there's more real-life examples that depict less of an extreme?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been asked this a couple of times. I mean, the fictional examples are relatively few and far between, I want to say. Like, there may be, I don't know, 5% of the cases I look at, and I think I haven't done a statistical analysis of my own work, but I use them when they're just like a particularly neat illustration of some phenomenon that is more narrative or literary or a trope than a real life case. So the way I use Gone Girl is saying, look, it's really wild to find this text, and look, you've had long enough to read it, so spoilers ahead. In Gone Girl, they set up a case where it looks like a domestic violence homicide. But then it turns out that not only did he not do anything wrong, at least vis-a-vis hurting her, she's crazy. Like, she has set the whole thing up and set him up, and the way the narrative kind of bends is in a sympathetic direction. So sympathy is my tongue-in-cheek name for the phenomenon where men are shown disproportionate or undue sympathy for misogynistic acts over their female victims, who I think should be centered and the primary subject of sympathy and empathy and so on. By the way, guess who came up with the name Himpathy? Because I was like, androphilia, it's not very catchy. So I asked my husband, and he's like, Himpathy, boom. And I get all the credit. I feel so sorry for him. Sorry. So Himpathy is kind of illustrated nicely by the narrative that sets up what would be ordinarily like a classic DV homicide, and then we find out, despite all the evidence, despite how things look, despite the narrative, actually it's all her fault. She's to blame, and he's completely innocent, and we feel sorry for him. And so it's a case that I think so nicely makes the point that we're so easily pulled in this direction that it didn't even, in reviews, typically make for a comment that this was a way to sort of take a classic scenario that happens all the time, like 2 or 3 times a day in the US, a man will murder his female intimate partner or wife, and yet the really popular narrative was one of, oh, but he didn't do it. And in fact, she was, a quote-unquote bitch, crazy bitch. So it had a very gaslighty feeling to it. And yeah, it would be hard to find a case that makes the point that when it comes to popular narratives, what we buy is very different than what is actually going on in the main. And that discrepancy is like a troubling gap. So, but most of my examples are real life ones, and a lot of them are really extreme. And yeah, I think one of the reasons that I think that's important is that I think misogyny is a self-masking phenomenon where trying to draw attention to the problem often attracts more of it. So you have these very extreme cases, like, we have an account that I open with of various men who are, let's say, politically powerful, who there's very strong evidence from police reports and interviews that they did very violent things towards women who they were in intimate relationships with, and no one holds them accountable. In fact, it seems, if anything, to either make no difference or to help them politically. And that's disturbing. Like, I want to really ask the reader to sit with those examples and bear witness to how severe a wrong can be done to girls and women among many, many other people in society, including trans and non-binary folks and racial minorities, and I could continue and continue, but how extreme violence can be towards vulnerable people, and we basically shrug as a collective. And I don't know another way to make that point, that this kind of indifference allows not just the second party to enact the violence, but as third parties, when we shrug and don't bear witness to the second party's wrongdoing, we allow rapists to remain in positions of enormous power. And so I think I want to ask readers perpetually to be better third parties, like to rise to the occasion and to say, we can bear witness to horrible things. And I know it's hard. I find all of this material like really confronting and horrible to have to think through. But I want to trust my reader to say, we can take this seriously, we can bear witness collectively, and we can view it as a moral task to care about girls and women, again, among many, many other marginalized and vulnerable people who are far too easily trodden on and no one does anything. Thanks. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you.
The next panelist is Sophia from sociology.
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you, Kate. So we were so interested in Chapter 8 and the concept of disgust and disgust sticking and arousing suspicion. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand a little more how stickiness happens, how we might get unstuck, and also how is it that some people seem impervious to stickiness when they do actually disgusting things. You know, one of the examples you give in the chapter is where research subjects are primed to feel disgust based on a certain word. You know, there's nothing innately disgusting about it. And yet we can see on the news every day certain politicians, for example, doing disgusting things and never being, disgust doesn't stick to them. So if you could help us understand a little bit more how stickiness happens, how we might get unstuck, and how some people become sticky proof. Yeah. that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Teflon. Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you, Sophia. So, like, the short answer is I think despite some people doing disgusting things, the disgust doesn't necessarily stick to them or get aroused in the first place. So there is this vast disparity between behaviors that ought to arouse moral disgust and consternation and behaviors and people who do attract a lot of disgust even when they've done nothing wrong or have done comparatively minor things wrong that don't deserve disgust. They maybe deserve more subtle reactions in terms of moral emotions and political reactions. So maybe a calling in rather than a calling out. And so I think, in a way, this is an important facet of political privilege. I think there is this dynamic, which, again, I want to emphasize, this is not universal. There are plenty of people who don't fall into these traps, but there is a certain number of people, and I think it's a fair proportion of the population, that when it comes to certain very, very elite, hyper-privileged white men who are, broadly speaking, bastions of patriarchy, there is really nothing they can do that will attract disgust, or with very, very few exceptions. I mean, we can name like a very, very few exceptions that would be kind of literally disgusting behavior that would arouse visceral disgust. So it's really telling, for example, and I think regardless of your own politics, you can see the interest of this example. One of the very few scandals that threatened to stick to Donald Trump last term was the golden shower stuff, which is like a viscerally disgusting example that involves sexual scruples and kink shaming and, you know, a bodily function that's broadly speaking disgusting to many or if not most people. Whereas lots of behaviors that even many people who found objectionable that didn't necessarily produce the long-term moral disgust that is very similar viscerally and psychologically to moral disgust. So moral disgust and visceral disgust are famously entangled tightly and hard to separate out. In fact, they're so tightly entangled that, to reference one of the studies that Sophia just mentioned, if you make someone feel visceral disgust, and then give them a moral scenario, they will be more morally judgmental because the visceral disgust makes them think they're feeling moral disgust for even innocent behavior. And so people, moral disgust and visceral disgust are at a physiological level, not really disentangleable. I think that's a word. So basically, I think a facet of privilege, especially on the political stage, is certain hyperprivileged men don't tend to attract a lot of disgust from some people. And I think that on the flip side, women, and I think this would be doubly true, if not more so, if we can quantify it, of non-binary folks, reliably attract visceral and moral disgust for doing completely innocent things. So one of the examples I use, and again, I think you can see the point of this example regardless of your own political preferences or affiliations. Hillary Clinton was sucking a cough drop before giving a speech, which is something I do all the time. It's just, who doesn't? Like, if you're giving a speech and you have a scratchy throat, it's smart. And she just removed it and popped it in a water glass. And, like, who cares, right? You know, she's a human being. She couldn't swallow a whole cough drop, and it was a quick... But that became like a meme. She's so disgusting. What was even the thought behind it? But my hypothesis, and again, this is an empirical hypothesis that I would love for people who can actually do the studies to investigate, is it's not really about the cough drop. It's that she's a woman trying to usurp a man in terms of a historically maximally male-coded position of power and prestige, the American presidency, where obviously we've never had a female president, and it's just the most masculine-coded authority position imaginable. And so what she's doing really is she's violating a social norm of deferring to men and not taking his power or trying to take what is perceived as his birthright away from him in terms of power. And that violation of a social norm is read as disgusting. And that's really why people are like, ugh, she's disgusting. Even though she's someone who, like, you have to really reach for a viscerally disgusting thing that she's done. And even those who find various of her policies or political records troubling, me included, that's not usually what people go after with the same kind of moral disgust as, like, the incidents that are comparatively minor and really, I think, are just about her being on stage trying to get political power, which for a woman is perceived as a disgusting thing to do, rendering her a nasty woman. So it's like the disgust attaches to all of the wrong things, and it fails to attach to many of the right things that do deserve disgusted, or at least moral consternation. And yeah, the final thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, but the final thing I'll say about disgust is, just as Sophia flagged, it's super sticky. So once it attaches to someone as a public figure, it tends to stick not only in the mind of the person who originally felt the disgust, but it also spreads between people. So the way this works is, if I express disgust towards something or someone, that will often come to be shared socially for very basic evolutionary reasons. If, for example, in our evolutionary past, I identified a food, let's say there's a cheese sandwich that is contaminated, and I evince disgust towards that because it made me sick, it's very beneficial for my friends, neighbors, and passers-by to, like, witness my disgust and be like, avoid, avoid, avoid the cheese sandwich that's contaminated. To even just read my body language of ugh, which is a very, like, universal facial expression, and avoid what I've evinced discuss towards so as to not get sick too. Does that make sense? That like spreading disgust is a good way to avoid contaminants and pathogens. And so once it enters the social arena, the fact that someone on social media expresses disgust towards a woman who's trying to gain power because, you know, let's say she wants to be president, that disgust can easily proliferate and enter the minds of people who otherwise wouldn't be hostile to her. And so even if they don't have that kind of misogynistic reaction, the disgust towards a woman qua norm violator, they can pick up on it and come to share it for very understandable reasons. They just like something about her that seems suspicious and kind of gross, and there must be something to it. And again, like in this particular case, I'm not suggesting for any particular political figure there's nothing to object to, quite the contrary. However, a lot of what was spread around many female political leaders has been, I think, more based on these irrational disgust reactions than actual objections to policies, records, and so on. And yeah, the sooner we can recognize that and say in ourselves, okay, I'm feeling this kind of feeling of squicked outness about this female leader, that might just be misogyny that I've picked up on blamelessly and unconsciously and socially. I'm going to see what's behind that and critically assess, is there something to this, or is it just like, I've caught a vibe? That's the question I try to ask myself, and that I think would be valuable to ask generally in order to ever have a female president for one case. Thank you.
So our next panelist is Sierra, also from sociology.
Hi. Thank you for joining us today. We really enjoyed reading the book and discussing it all semester. And one of the points early on that we discussed was actually either in your introduction or in chapter 1, where you deliberately make the choice to rely on the gender binary, and even more specifically, the cisgender gender binary. And you say that you're going to use that analysis throughout the rest of the book. But we also know that both non-binary and transgender folks experience much more violence, gender-based violence in particular, than cisgender folks of either gender. And so I'm wondering if you would mind telling us a little bit more about this methodological choice to use both a binary that we know is not real and also a privileged category from which to do the analysis.
Yeah. That is a great question, Sierra, and I want to make it clear that when I grant this assumption for the sake of argument, I believe it is a false assumption. So often in philosophy, we kind of grant false assumptions for the purposes of seeing, like to invoke the title of the book, what is the logic of misogyny? And I think part of that logic is the false, pernicious, dreadful assumption that gender is an exclusive, exhaustive binary that divides people into boys and girls, men and women, from birth based on biological features, which is so false. We know non-binary folks exist. We know intersex folks exist. Trans identities are valid, beautiful, and it is more important to me now more than ever, and it has always been important to make it very clear that I am and will always be a trans-inclusive feminist. And I think that one of the ways in which I would write this book differently now, if I were to do it again, which I hope I don't want to go, it nearly killed me the first time. I don't want to do it again. But I think I would have more confidence to say the following. I think misogyny and trans-misogyny are not only in cahoots, as I argued the first time around, but they are, like, in a way, one and the same thing that comes from a place that the brilliant trans philosopher Talia May Betcher has theorized, I think, better than anyone among other leading trans philosophers. And her analysis is basically that there is an insistence in social space that genital arrangements match gender presentation, which I think is a very important thing from the perspective of white supremacist, cis-sexist patriarchy and just transphobic patriarchy. If I can put it bluntly, it's like from that perspective, the desire is to preserve a class of people who are cis women who can do this reproductive, emotional, domestic, and material labor for designated privileged men, and who can be spotted on sight based on gender presentation. And so if you think about it that way, that white supremacist cis patriarchy is deeply invested in kind of preserving a class of women, cis women, who can be bred with and married by designated privileged men. It makes trans women, among others, anathema to the system, and enormous amounts of hostility and just vicious policing are poured into the prospect that someone could be what Talia calls a pretender or a deceiver vis-a-vis this class of people who are meant to be visually inspectable on sight based on really their clothing and gender presentation more than anything, with a view to they have the capacities that patriarchy wants to preserve as forms of labor for the most hyperprivileged men, especially to benefit from and exploit. So does that make sense that, I mean, the book was written at a time where I felt some trepidation about speaking with trans feminists in a way that I didn't want to speak over anyone, but I think I'm more confident today, having had the benefit of brilliant trans scholarship and community in, you know, really my daily life as well as my scholarly activities, to say that I think that the analysis I offer of misogyny and Talia's analysis of trans misogyny are just really dovetail nicely to explain the particular hostility that trans women are facing that is so toxic, pernicious, harmful, and often lethal right now. And I'll add that there's a ton to say about trans men, non-binary folks, and I think we'll get into some of that, but hopefully that's a start at least at kind of how I actually see things and what I wasn't quite confident enough to say the first time around as someone who really wants to not be speaking over anyone, but now feels like I'm speaking with people I'm in intellectual and political community with. So that's, yeah, that's the view.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next panelist is Carolyn from the philosophy department.
So first, Kate, let me thank you for this work, not just on the face of it, but because it led to this. It led to me getting to spend weeks reading with these folks and some people out there, and community makes things possible. It made me accountable to actually doing the reading, and that it's not always easy to find time to read things I'm not utterly required to read. And I think there's all kinds of ways that community makes people accountable, not just to the pages, but it's a nice, I think, metaphor, or synecdoche. But I think that it's also true that when we read in community, we're less isolated, and then these communities give rise to more discussions, and that I think the opposite is true also. That the less of this we do, the more isolated we become, the more we lean into our busyness or our isolation, the more it repeats. I think there's a sort of feedback loop. And maybe this isn't even unrelated to my question, but I think it's just a fact of how much I've enjoyed spending time with my colleagues and getting to do more and meeting more people. And so the question that I want to ask, though, is about the relationship between the economy of giving and taking that is central to your understanding of misogyny and what we call the attention economy. Right, so this is a term that's at least 50 years old when located specifically in like marketing and advertising stuff, but it's getting a wider cachet, and there's a view that maybe we live in an attention economy, an economy where instead of the exchange of goods and services, the things that are of value and probably scarce are attention, and that we're trading in attention. And I'm thinking even of sort of the way Chris Hayes is writing and about really concerned about the rise of the attention economy. And I was really struck, and we talked a bit about it in the group, about that maybe even some of the ways that women's narratives of victimhood aren't getting taken up, and there isn't space for this, because in an attention economy, right, what is scarce and what is commodified is attention. And so giving women's victimhood attention takes from male attention. Yeah. And so at least that I wonder if you're willing to talk about, or if the question about the attention economy triggers any other thoughts.
Yeah, it so does. Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, and thank you too for anyone who has read the book, and especially to the whole reading group, because there's no greater privilege as an author than being read and engaged with critically and in a engaged way. And I really value and appreciate that. So thank you. And yeah, now is the time for intellectual community. I think now more than ever. So yeah, I feel the same way. Reading groups are life. I think, you asked such a good question, and it really pings for me. I mean, I haven't applied the analysis of the attention economy specifically to this framework, but I think it really fits with the analysis I offer of empathy, because, like, part of what happens when we hear a story like the story of Brock Turner, the now notorious Stanford rapist who, trigger warning, sexually assaulted Chanel Miller behind a dumpster on Stanford's campus after a party. And I recommend to everyone the book Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is her gripping, riveting, incredibly moving, but also just really sharp account of how sympathetic attention was so easily diverted to Brock Turner over her, and maybe never arrived at her doorstep in the first place. She, despite being clearly the victim, there was no ambiguity about this. The reason we know this is that Brock Turner was caught in the act by two visiting Swedish graduate students who performed a citizen's arrest. So there were two eyewitnesses to him raping her, which is very unusual. And they were very conscientious witnesses, so there was no difficulty securing their testimony, which is again unusual. One wonders, like, rogue thought, but one wonders if being Swedish had anything to do with that sense of justice, actually, in terms of gender justice. Anyway. And yet people actively cared more about Brock, and also were so much more attentive to the potential loss of his bright future, as, headlines were all about, he was a swimmer, he might have made the Olympics, he had a scholarship for swimming, he's losing all these things. It's like, yes, and he ought to, and he did that, right? It's not like they were being taken away from him as a form of injustice. These are actually the just consequences for this kind of behavior. Like, many people, me included, have grave scruples about carceral justice, but certainly social consequences for rape are entirely fitting. Cancel culture gets an awfully bad name, but cancelling rapists is good, actually. Known rapists should be cancelled. That's like my PSA. We can stop buying their books in the case of a Neil Gaiman. We can stop supporting their TV and movie and, money-making activities generally. These are social consequences that are actually not always available, but when they are, how good to have an avenue other than the horribly unjust and racialized carceral criminal justice system in the US to pursue a form of accountability that is just saying, I'm not going to pay attention to you anymore, actually. Anyway, side note, but connected. So I think a lot of the way these mechanisms work is we're so worried about the hymns of it all, and we so erase her, like I call this erasure, which, yeah, again, gets at the way that we just don't pay attention to ways in which she was so obviously affected by the trauma, and not just, again, the second party who did something dreadful to her, but the way third parties were indifferent, the very fact of the attention economy being directed towards caring about him more than her, despite her being the innocent victim and him being the perpetrator, that itself, I think, was a form of what I call violent indifference that was itself traumatizing. And I think her account brings that out clearly, that when we fail to bear witness to those who are wronged, we not only perpetuate some of these harms, but we actually inflict an independent and important form of harm in the form of this indifference. So, yeah, this is all very inchoate, but I think one of the thoughts I'm having is paying attention, or as I've been putting it, bearing witness to those who are being wronged is really important. And it's not just doom scrolling. When you have images that, I mean, and this is not always true, sometimes it's more traumatizing to other folks in your community and sharing is not the thing to do. But right now I'm seeing, for example, people sharing images of the men who are being abducted and placed in what I regard as concentration camps in El Salvador. And bearing witness to those horrors is not doom scrolling, and it's not pointless. It is bearing witness and paying attention and saying, I care, and everyone should care about this grave injustice. And that is not nothing. That's a way of not betraying the people who are being wronged in this moment, even if it is not always possible to do a huge amount else. I mean, of course, do things that are practical too when possible, but even when it's not or you've exhausted those measures, simply bearing witness and paying attention, I think is a way of helping to do justice to the victims of injustice. Thank you.
So before we give the panel a second round, I want to make a couple announcements and also see if the audience wants to raise their hands and ask questions. So the announcements are these, that those of you who are here and need to have a record of that, there's a place to sign out before you leave. Andrew Jones is waving it around, so there's a sign-out sheet. You can also, students, pick up a free copy of Dr. Mann's book, and later in the day there'll be a book signing, so you can get some value added by coming and getting, what do we call that? A signature? An autograph, right. So I encourage everybody to do that. And at this time, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Students get dibs.
Yeah, and ask me anything.
I'm curious about your analysis of the way domestic violence, restraining order type situation was used to shame Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and to some extent I felt his wife in the news about people being abducted to El Salvador.
Yeah.
I thought that was remarkable.
Yeah, it really is, because, I mean, it's not like our current cabinet is free of such issues. if I can put it delicately. I mean, Trump is legally declared in civil court to be a rapist. So put it this way, I think it is a very good example of opportunistic racism. And one thing we have to be really on the lookout for when it comes to misogyny is a kind of concern trolling about othered men's supposed misogyny in a way that is often completely selective, opportunistic, used as a way to other, often false. I mean, when it comes to false accusations, this is one of the areas where we have to be very careful and intersectional and not dismissive of the fact that there is a very long history of false accusations towards racially othered men in terms of particularly sexual assault. So I guess what I would say is I think we have to be really on the lookout for ways in which selective attention to misogyny and misogynistic acts can be used to other people who are the victims of terrible injustices, and whatever they've done or haven't done, the question should be due process, the question should be of the abduction, the question should be the conditions in the El Centro del Terrorismo in El Salvador, which are abhorrent. It is one of the worst prisons on earth. And yeah, until we're having a conversation about domestic violence across the board, that is not a conversation that is productive with respect to what we should be focused on right now, which is the abduction, the conditions, the lack of due process, and the astonishing pace at which, you know, a concept that I don't usually have a lot of use for, but the rule of law is being decimated. Thank you.
Since we have an appropriate mic for people to go to the mic who have further questions. And again, students have dibs, but everybody who has questions should go to the mic.
Well, I'm kind of following up on her question and your answer about selective attention.
Yeah.
And it relates to the protester Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia, who was arrested. Yeah. And the lead in every news article was, he was arrested in front of his heavily pregnant wife. And it made me uncomfortable because I was enraged at the lack of due process.
Yeah, it is a great point. And I mean, one thing that I've been emphasizing in my analysis of that case is the way the moves wielded against Columbia, particularly with respect to the abduction of Mahmoud Khalil and now other students who are green card holders. I don't know if it's public news yet, so I won't disclose names in case it's not, but there is another case that unfolded over the last few days. These moves are straight out of the domestic violence playbook in terms of how the Trump administration is wielding power against people in ways that do a couple of things that domestic violence does. One is it is deeply dependent on financial control. So the idea of withholding funds is just like a go-to move, fairly obviously. Another aspect of it is one of the crucial technologies of domestic violence is abductions or threats of abductions, particularly the most vulnerable parties. Here, the analogy would be between children and students. And a third aspect of it that is worth highlighting and maybe a little more subtle is the classic Davo technique of deny, attack, but more than anything, reverse victim and offender. So here, and this is played out at Cornell too, the idea that these protesters were offenders where they in fact did nothing wrong, They exercise their constitutionally protected rights of protest, of something which I count as genocide, and that is at the very least should be uncontroversially counted as something that involves genocidal actions according to just the definition of the UN, and is a humanitarian crisis in terms of the war in Gaza. These were protesters who were protesting that, and the idea has become these are people guilty of anti-Semitism, which I'm not saying there has never been an anti-Semitic incident in terms of these protests, but if you look at really top-notch reporting that went behind the scenes in these protests, that is vanishingly unusual. These were protests where there were seders, and they were multi-ethnic, multiracial, and they were protests against injustice that involved students of every faith, including Jewish students, standing up for Palestinians. And yet, the reversal of victim and offender has, I think, been this incredibly powerful mechanism, again, straight out of the domestic violence playbook, to say someone like Mahmoud Khalil is an offender and is dangerous rather than someone who is being just horribly victimized. And I think because, in a way, we've slightly bought into that reframing, just as you astutely point out, pointing to his heavily pregnant wife becomes a kind of trope for trying to reestablish his vulnerability when, I mean, of course, I feel terrible for her, I feel terrible for their child, but the injustice is being done to him, and like, that's enough. That should be enough to arouse our sympathy and concern and, more than anything, demand for justice on his behalf and behalf of the many others who've been similarly mistreated and abducted. And yet we have to kind of invoke this trope where it's super selective. We don't care about the pregnant women who are going septic in Texas and dying because of the criminalization of reproductive health care. But suddenly, like, you place a heavily pregnant woman next to a man who you're trying to establish sympathy for, and that very selective trope can be used to somewhat help with the narrative, even though it's not like we reliably care about pregnant people, not by a very long shot. So thank you. Sorry, I'm just saying yes, basically, in a very long. Yeah. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't need to be.
Thanks, Kate. I want to follow up on a question that Sophia and Sophia asked. Questions about shame and disgust. We've started to talk about it a little bit already. And one of the things that are so peculiar is that with some people, neither shame nor disgust seem to stick, right? As Sophia pointed out, and you agreed. And so we always wonder, why is it that the people who do all these shameful things and all those disgusting things, and we try to shame them and we try to show how disgusting it is, it doesn't stick. And so I wonder whether that's, what are we trying to do, and should we try to do something else? So should we try and succeed? Are we just not good enough at shaming and sort of bringing about disgust? Or is that something that we shouldn't want to be doing in the first place because it's the kind of weapon of the oppressor that they use very effectively and that they are somehow impervious to? So I'm always wondering about, so what are the non-violent ways? As we share a love for Iris Murdoch's work. So I wonder, is there any kind of just attention that we can pay to these perpetrators? And then at the same time, reading your book, I read a very loud warning against this, because if we do this, if we pay attention, we're doing exactly the kind of thing, right? We're doing the kind of giving, right, that they think they are anyway entitled to. So it seems like finding a non-violent way that doesn't rely on shaming and disgusting That's why I'm just puzzled, and I was wondering whether you had anything that could help us here.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. And again, I want to thank Raja, Dr. Rosenhagen, for originally having the idea of having me out. It's such a pleasure and a privilege, so thank you. I love the question because I just share it, and I don't have a good answer to it, because I'll tell you something I wrote 10 years ago in my notebook. I wrote in the run-up to 2016 and 2015, I wrote, Trump is going to win over Clinton. Those will be the nominees, and it was still very unclear that that was going to be the case, but I said, and Trump will win because when it comes to shame, he is Teflon. And that is, to me, the most salient feature of Trump. And again, I think you can probably observe this to be the case regardless of your political preferences or affiliations. I mean, I make no secret of my own, but I do try to, when I can, offer points that can be more generally agreed upon. And here is this very interesting feature of Trump. He is devoid of shame. And I say this not to shame him, but just as an empirical observation. For example, if he misspeaks or makes a mistake or contradicts himself or rambles, most people, like, you can see the shame on their faces. Even if they try to hide it, there's like a reaction and there's a trying to back up or salvage. And he does not do that, and it's like so striking. And it's interesting because people read him as moralistic in various ways, and he isn't. Like, I think he is almost devoid of showing moral reactions to things. He shows what are a ton of just visceral disgust reactions, but he doesn't have those visceral disgust reactions towards himself, which means that he doesn't feel or evince shame. Because I think of shame as like the first person analog of a third person and second personal reaction of disgust. So if I evince disgust towards someone, then if they take that up, if there's uptake, they will feel shame. And similarly, if someone feels shame, it kind of attracts disgust oftentimes, at least if we're somewhat unsympathetic to what they've confessed or done. So I think shaming him will never, ever, ever work. And that was obvious 10 years ago, because what he does is demonstrate something which is quite liberating to his base that often feels, again, rightly or wrongly, like it's been overly shamed by liberals and progressives. So it is extremely emboldening and, in a way, I think, exhilarating for Trump's base to see these shame-free, Teflon-like performances, because a lot of the people most attracted to Trump feel like liberals and progressives, people like me basically, are constantly shaming them for like a little verbal mistake or not being politically this or that. They're like very sensitive to the shaming reactions of people on my side of the political spectrum who, you know, traffic in moral judgments about exclusion and injustice. And so I just want to record how hard of a problem this is. Shaming him, even making fun of him, anything in the contempt or looking down upon family only leads to a doubling down and a kind of screw you reaction, if I can put it in a frank way. Because, yeah, like his whole shtick is shame will never stick to me. The whole performance, the whole persona is a bulwark against the shame that people are rebelling against currently. Now, I'm resistant to the idea that shame should be fled from. Like, I said I was a shame-prone person, and when I say I think shame can be very appropriate, I include myself in that. Like, shame is not something to flee from. It's something I should, like, take a moment and think, like, I do feel shame about this, that, or the other thing. You know, for example, I feel a certain amount of shame that Down Girl wasn't kind of more boldly trans-inclusive in a way that it would be if I wrote it again today. And I think that's appropriate, and I think that's good, and I don't think it's something to flee from. And so I don't have a pragmatic solution, but morally, I feel like what needs to happen is we need to get good with feeling shame, not fleeing from shame, being able to face our shame, and thinking, okay, I'm going to lift my head, look forward, and do better, and not use the shame as a pretext for the natural reaction, which is to want to disappear. But we don't have to do that. We can say, no, this is like a sign, the shame I'm feeling, that I've made a misstep, and I feel both guilt, but also kind of shame in my whole persona. Lift my head, look people in the eye, at least metaphorically, it's kind of an ableist metaphor, but you get the picture, and move on with a sense of, okay, we all make mistakes, we all do shameful things, we're all in this boat together, and we have to be able to face our shame and improve. But yeah, that's not a popular or really feasible solution politically, because shame is anathema to most people. Yeah. Yeah, that I don't know. And I mean, in a way, I think it points to this broader thing, which is once you're there, you're toast. The solution rested many, many steps back, where we didn't need a shameless figure to embolden people who felt not only shame, but unable to cope with shame. So the solution is however long ago, culturally, to enable people to deal with moral shame effectively, and in a way to be able to move on from it quickly and without too much shame accruing to the shame. But yeah, I think the other point you made that I might just speak to very briefly is that this is a particularly hard problem because I think the Murdochian idea that I find so attractive of paying just loving attention to the other is in a way a liability when it comes to the hyperprivileged. And it's a very powerful and important idea that I think has its place with respect to people who are marginalized. And in a way, we need to do less in the way of generous and charitable interpretation to those who are the most privileged. Even though I don't think Murdoch would have liked that line, but I think it is, in a way, what thinking through the interpersonal politically implies, that the work of justice and love is primarily about someone like her example of Dee in the M&D example, who was, this is Murdoch's famous example of a mother-in-law who is uncharitable and thinks ill of her daughter-in-law, who, reading between the lines, it's a class issue. And she thinks of Dee as too impudent and forward and glib, where she should, if she was being fair, think of her as refreshing and frank and, as she puts it, gay, meaning jovial. Yeah. Thanks.
So come to the microphone if you have a question.
Hi, my name is Jesse Verduzco. I'm an environmental science student here at Fresno State. I haven't read your book yet, so I apologize if you address this in your book at all. But my question is, what do you feel like are proper techniques to combat misogynistic comments between equals? You speak on shame, but is there other avenues to address comments like that?
So that's a great question. I feel like it's a really nice follow-up to Raj's question. So this won't solve politics, but interpersonally, and Jesse, right? Jesse. So I think Jesse points to a dynamic that if I were queen for a day, I would love to encourage. It won't happen, but which is just a kind of shame-free calling in of, I think misogyny is really ubiquitous. I think we all channel it. That includes me. And it would be really nice if instead of it being viewed as you're practicing misogyny or channeling it or invoking it, perhaps unintentionally and perhaps completely, like, it's sort of bypassed your rational processes and gone via these disgust, via sort of vibes you've picked up on. It'd be really nice if people could call in others doing that in a way that is like, this happens to the best of us. It's not a shameful thing. It's actually, or it is in a sense, like it's shameful we're this misogynistic culturally, but it happens to all of us and it's really okay, and we can do this without this sense that you've channeled misogyny, so you're a misogynist. So I reserve the term misogynist for someone who is like an overachiever in the misogyny system. And the idea is, I think we all practice misogyny inadvertently, unconsciously, unwittingly, or despite our best intentions. And misogynist is a shaming label that should be reserved for the worst offenders. So if someone could, for example, say like, hey, like, you seem really down on this female job candidate, for example, but like, actually, it's really normal and common to not want to look up to women, and to, especially when men and women compete for prestigious male-dominated positions, to favor the male candidate. Could this be part of what's going on? Yeah. I can tell you from bitter past experience, if I say this to someone, it doesn't go well. But like, the premise of this is, I do this too. It happens to the best of us. Between peers, between moral equals, like, it should be possible to say this without it being like, you're a horrible misogynist, you hate women, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no. These are social forces we all channel. Does that make sense as a...
Yeah,
like,
so you think we should address it more with educating each other, or at least questioning, like, why do you feel that way?
Yeah, like, can we point to some evidence that she's actually abrasive or problematic or shrill, or is this just how we read women who are trying to gain male-coded authority positions? And very often it's the latter. And yeah, like saying to someone in a spirit of, you know, there but for the grace, or we all do it, or we've all done it, and not have that produce defensiveness, that's my like dream.
Okay.
But it's not how things tend to go. And it can be more how things can go when you have that understanding with peers and intimates and so on. Like, I regularly will ask like people I'm close to, am I just being misogynistic, or is this person really, really annoying? You know, and it's a legitimate question that I too need to ask myself, despite having written 2 books on misogyny.
Hi. I'm feeling a little bit of shame. Oh, sorry, myself for this question and embarrassment and stuff like that. But I'm a white cis, or no, am I cis? I don't know. I'm a white man, right? Okay, here we go. Okay, so. And as a teenager and stuff, like, I've grown up like a liberal and everything like that. I'm concerned with social issues and inequality and wealth equality and things like that. You know, we grow up in a society where like men are like meant to like dominate and stuff like that. That's our role, right? But the white man is demonized. You know, it's like, so when we hear, like, when we speak about white men, you know, it's like it makes me, you know, sorry, but it's embarrassing, but it makes me feel, you know, kind of shitty, and I understand all the problems, but ever since, like, as a kid, so it was like, it's not only that, it's like in poor populations and populations of color. So it's like, but I grew up poor, you know, so I was like exposed to lead and, you know, everything, you know, I didn't have good schools and stuff like that. So it's like, the way we speak about this, you know, because there's so many, like, so I feel like we're pushing white men to the other side, so like they can, like what you just said in response, like one of the last things you said, like we need to be able to speak to each other. So, and so the white men who feel this way or who are getting this way, they go into these silos, you know, and if they hear anything, you know, that, you know, like colonizer for existence in like black neighborhoods, you know, who are, you know, white colonizers, you know, so it's so frustrating. So I feel like we're pushing people away, and they just can't hear us, and I want to know what we can do about that. Like, you know, we have this word Karen for a specific type of woman. You know, I would like to suggest that we can have a name for a specific type of man instead of saying white man. You know, it's like
Karen is a racial slur.
Is it?
Yeah,
oh, for
it
white
is.
women. For
Yes,
white women.
It is.
But
I
it,
can
but
tell you
it,
as a white woman, if someone that applies that to me, that's a racial slur.
right.
Which term?
Karen.
Karen. Oh, it's as big a racial slur as the many others we know.
Right. It is, and it is coded like when I picture a Karen, it is a blonde white lady, you know, with this white streaks in her, with the blonde streaks in her hair, you know, they do the chunky streaks, the whole thing.
Let me say that my reaction to the term Karen is very different depending on who is wielding it. So I think it can be a legitimate shorthand for racial minorities, especially black women, to point to a real dynamic in terms of white female entitlement. However, I often see it weaponized in very misogynistic ways against women who happen to be white. So anyway, that's like a background to say I think the term Karen is super complicated, actually, from the lens of like the intersection of misogyny and racism. And I've heard people moot the idea that we should use Ken as the, the equivalent. But look, I really hear where you're coming from, and I appreciate that perspective. Sorry, I missed your name.
Oh, Ryan.
Brian?
Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. I think, you know, I have a complex reaction to the question because part of it is getting our quantifiers right. Like so many of these worries about, you know, I've talked about men today, and I've talked about privileged men, and that includes whiteness as a, you know, a dimension of privilege. But I want to make it really clear that this is not an all-white men argument. I don't think any feminist believes that. Like, the not all men hashtag is in a way odious, surplus to requirements. Like, it's never been about all. The interesting point is only. Like, there are some crimes and forms of wrongdoing that are almost exclusively male. So it's not by any means all men or even all white men. It's not even close. Most white men are not doing these things. It's rather, it's almost only men, and sometimes almost only white men, who have the forms of privilege that allow them to do these dastardly things. For example, family annihilation is an overwhelmingly white male crime. Now, I think many white men, you know, some of my best friends and colleagues and husbands included, are white men who have the privilege to do bad things that because they have a sense of justice and conscience and political savvy, they would never take advantage of these entitlements. So one way to analyze it is oftentimes white men have certain entitlements that many white men do not take advantage of because they're moved by a sense of justice and, yeah, like love for the other. And I think one thing to say here is none of this is done with a sense of malice towards white men or a sense that white men are just hopeless. Like, if anything, it's a sense of, like, you can do great. Like, you can be every morally worthwhile thing, I know it's possible because it's actual. Like, I, in some sense, do this work out of a belief in people that they can be motivated by moral scruples and conscience and, yeah, a sense of justice and love to be better than they would have to be if they were just doing what they were entitled to do and could get away with socially. So does that make sense? Like, I think it is important to recognize that there are some really terrible things that are, for the most part, exclusively or primarily the province of men or sometimes white men. And at the same time, that's not the majority. That's not even sometimes the vast majority. And I think that to the extent that white men are an important part of my audience, like, this is done with a sense of hope that people can and will do better when they know better. Not all the time, not reliably, not, you know, in terms of like, let's put money on percentages, but like, I just know that I hear from readers, including white male readers, who've been motivated to try harder, do better, and that is, yeah, I think, like, part of what we're all doing, regardless of our own social position in all of this. So yeah, none of this is done with a desire to demonize. It's really done with a sense of, oh, you can do better, and we can all do better, but some of us are deemed entitled to do things that are really bad without the social consequences that stay the hands of most of us. And so, in a way, white men have this additional challenge of, it's often moral conscience that needs to be the stopper for certain kinds of actions. Of course, then we could get into the intersections here. It's very different for poor white men versus rich white men. It's very different for white men who are queer versus white men who are, you know, we could go on and on and on. But hopefully that's at least a starting place as to how to think of this with a certain sense of moral hope and not anything like fatalism or despair or cynicism. Really a sense of, yeah, like, this is possible because it's actual, and I see it in my students, I see it in my partner and colleagues and friends, and yeah.
So we have maybe 5 minutes, and if there are still questions, that would be fine, or we can give the panelists a chance if there's something on your list that you would think urgent enough for the last few minutes. Go for it. Sierra.
Sorry, I'm so
I'm just reading
excited to ask
faces.
this question, and it's actually about your conclusion, so I'm hoping maybe it helps us wrap this part of the day up. So, in your last chapter, you don't really give us anywhere to go. And that's okay.
Fair.
And it was something that we spent a lot of time talking about when we read the conclusion. But also a lot has changed since then, right? We were at the start of the first Trump regime. We're now, ooh, I did use that word, we're now in the second Trump term. Misogyny, I don't want to say there's more of it. I think it's maybe just more out in the open and easily observable. And you've also talked about becoming a parent, and specifically to a little girl. And as someone who's also recently a parent to a little girl, I'm wondering if you've got something additional to offer us, or if you could rewrite the book, what would the conclusion look like today?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sierra. The conclusion, for those of you who haven't read it, was a combination of fuck 'em, in terms of like not pandering to certain kinds of rhetoric and like questions like, are women just bad at math? Like, no, we're great at most things. And like when I hear those kinds of questions, I'm like, oh, you sound defensive about the fact that women are actually doing brilliantly. And that isn't always good news to previously dominantly situated group members. Anyway, the combination of fuck 'em and I give up. So it's a very, I know, it was not a politic conclusion. And I want to say, like, I wouldn't write it differently then, as in I don't regret anything I said, because the conclusion of a book is a genre that I really dislike. It's like, well, I've done all this diagnosis, and now here's 2 pages on solutions, which I don't really have. And that was what I was expected to do. And I just was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't have the solutions. I'm a diagnostician. I'm not a solutions person. I'm not a policy person, and I'm a very pessimistic person. And like, when I said I give up, the emphasis was on the I. I'm not saying we should all give up. And also, it probably should have had the caveat that makes for a less of a literary flourish, but it should have been, I give up for now. And it was sort of a way of saying, I reject the feminine-coded obligation to give hope at the end of this, like, tome on strangulation and domestic violence and family annihilation and sexual harassment and rape and political, like, furor and et cetera, and to say, like, no, I feel really despairing now, and I want you to feel that with me as a reader. That doesn't mean that that's the way I feel all the time, or that that's the way I felt forever. It was like, that's how I felt when I was writing the conclusion. And the conclusion of my second book was, and I wrote the second book while I was pregnant with my daughter, who's now 5, it was, I have been despairing about misogyny and the prospect of getting people to take it seriously. But first of all, the fact that the book got something very tricky to get, which is attention. I mean, like, I really expected the book to get no uptake, and it did get a lot of uptake compared to at least my goals and predictions. And so I felt a lot less despairing that there were a lot of people who really do care about misogyny. I mean, you're all here today, and that is huge. And I mean, my despair was really tempered by the fact that people cared enough to engage with me, disagree with me, write me, read the book, have their own take that was often very different from mine, point to intersections I'd missed, all sorts of things that meant, yes, there are all sorts of people who don't take misogyny seriously, but there are all sorts of people who do. And that gave me some hope. And the other thing of it was, I think despair can be something of a luxury. I felt like I was obligated to cultivate a less despairing attitude, not an optimistic one, not a glass half full attitude, but like I call it, I'm thirsty. You know, like a really like motivated, I'm in this fight because I have, you know, a kid now, and it puts me in a different social position. It puts me in a position where, you know, sometimes I have to sell the world to someone. And that involves looking at what it could be, to invoke Maggie Smith's Good Bones poem, that, yeah, I'm not always in the mood to be a realtor, but sometimes I have to be despite myself. And that's, again, not about like what everyone should feel, it's about what I feel right now. And that, again, could change. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we've used our time. I want to thank everybody who's here, especially students who asked questions, but also those of you who've just been listening and paying attention and not asking questions publicly. I bet you're asking questions somewhere. And there will be other opportunities. And let's thank all the panelists as well as Dr. Kate Manne. And let's also thank the organization that made this all happen, and the library, and Janet Crum, and the committee. What a treat.